So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the GE Academy webinar titled Re-humanizing Work and Life in Academia and Research, Women and Men as Partners in Building Gender Equality. My name is Maria San Giuliano, and together with my colleague Natasha Sega, we are partners of the GE Academy project, and we will moderate this webinar, where we are extremely pleased to have two distinguished speakers such as Jen De Vries and Tim Muirhead with us, in spite of the time zones from Australia. So before we start, we will spend a few minutes introducing you to the project, the GE Academy project, for those of you who might not be familiar with it. So we started, and we are in the concluding phase of the GE Academy project, indeed, considering the big challenge of having, on one hand, quite a large body of knowledge on gender in research and institutional change for gender equality, but still limited appropriation of gender analysis within research projects, and quite a gap in terms of differences among research performing organizations in different areas of Europe and within the same countries, indeed, and also a small proportion of researchers and practitioners familiar with concepts, methods, and practices. So, with the purpose of addressing this challenge, the project GE Academy was run within the Horizon 2020 program, with the purpose of really designing, implementing, and evaluating high-quality capacity building program, targeting research organizations, both research funding and research performing organizations, on how to really achieve sustainable institutional change for gender equality. Our offer has been a multi-format one. So we started before the COVID pandemic with different face-to-face programs, in-person, interactive participatory workshops and trainings, and an e-learning component together with the summer schools. We are here running this webinar as part of the e-learning component of the GE Academy program, but then we had to switch most of the formats online due to the pandemic, of course. The partnership is, the project is led by Labs, with the scientific coordination from Yellow Window. It's a strong consortium with a lot of experience in this particular field of building capacity, operationalizing gender equality policies in academia. And we had to have indeed a great adaptability, flexibility, and resilience to really navigate the last couple of years with the pandemic. So you find all the materials from the project, all the recordings on our YouTube channel that I invite you to follow. And as I mentioned, we are within one of the last webinars in the webinar series that presents, let's say, the most compact formats within the program. We have done so far 14 webinars on several topics. In several cases, the webinars are introductory to longer trainings, and often performed in collaboration with sister projects. Having said that, just to recall, this webinar is also part of our doc curriculum, our e-learning course that is still ongoing. So welcome also to those participants from the GE Academy doc who might have decided to follow this live session from the mini course on work-life balance and organizational culture. I would just leave the floor to Natasha for continuing, and then our invited speakers.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome to everyone also from my side. I will have the honor of introducing you our speaker and today's webinar learning objectives. So the goal of today's webinar is to reflect and dialogue about the different challenges and the different, of course, work of women and men, but also respectively the dominant and non-dominant culture in creating equity and humanity in these all spheres of work and living condition. To create equity with work and life balance, not at the expense of the life, the personal life, and to reflect about the key to doing this work in partnership instead of having men as allies. And the two speakers will also introduce us with the famous bifocal approach, combining the personal and the structural organizational change, and then on working as partners in doing the gender equality work. This is the agenda of today's webinar. So after this short introduction, we will have a long session in duo with our two experts. And after the presentation, there will be the possibility for you to ask questions directly to our speakers. Just a little bit of technicalities, even though we are very all familiar with this platform at this point. But I just want to recall you to use the question and answer button that you can find at the bottom of your screen to pose the question for the speakers during the Q&A session, while to chat with the other attendees or to report about technical issues, please use the chat box. So without further delay, let me introduce you our two experts from Australia. I'm very honored that they accepted our invitation. Jen De Vries is an independent gender strategy and organizational development consultant and researcher. She's particularly specialized in organizational culture change and about the link of individual development with the organizational change. She's now placing emphasis in increasing the participation of men in gender equality work. And here is where Tim is coming in this scene. Tim is director of the Community, Spirit and Development Network since 30 years. Has worked a lot with Jen De Vries to bring the lessons of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal dialogue to the challenging and possibility of gender partnership. So I'm very, very excited to have you here today, and without further delay, I leave you the screen to conduct your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha. So I hope everybody can hear me. I'm just wanting to put up the slide that introduces our work, Re-humanising Work and Life in Academia and Research. And I want to begin with something that happened for me, and I'll stop the share while I'm doing this. This thing happened some time ago when Jen asked me, as a member of the dominant culture who's worked in areas with Aboriginal people from the dominant culture perspective, to work with a company that wanted to ensure better gender equity, particularly at management level. And that was great, and I was delighted to be asked. And we began by talking to managers in that company about what it might take. And I heard a few things that deeply disturbed me. one thing I heard was from a manager, a male manager, I don't see my kids awake except on the weekend. And then the other thing I heard is, you can't do this job without a wife at home. And I thought, this is madness. This is not a healthy culture. And so I went back to Jen and said, Jen, what might we be colluding in here? Might we be, are we mistaking equity for drawing women into the madness that has been created by the patriarchy and into the toxic cultures that can develop from that? And that little crisis has led us to quite an interesting conversation. And I'll hand back to Jen there to take us from there.
Thanks, Tim. And also we should say thank you for the lovely invitation. And we were just so delighted that the Gender Equality Academy found us. And now I'm delighted to have found the Gender Equality Academy and all that's on offer. Just amazing. I'm pointing my Australian colleagues in the right direction now. So I wanted to share another sort of pivotal moment that's really impacted, I guess, on my thinking. Tim and I had run a Partners for Change workshop at the University of Auckland. Now, those of you who've got good Southern Hemisphere geography will know that Tim and I in Perth, Western Australia, are actually quite a long way from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. But at that time, I was visiting them 3 times a year to work with them. So the workshop involved equal numbers of men and women, and we'll tell you a bit more about the workshops later. But what happened is that when I revisited the university, I don't know, about 6 months later, I did a follow-up meeting with the original workshop participants, and Tim wasn't able to join me on that occasion. And we had many more women than men in the room, a fact that people commented on. And then the only man who was present, in fact, we only had one man, he made some very useful contributions to the conversation, and then he made his apologies and he left early. And I just had this sinking feeling as I watched him walk out of the door. My response was immediate. We should just stop now. We should just stop right now. And that was my instinct. I wanted to stop right there and to wrap up the meeting. But of course I didn't. And the conversation continued. But I was really struck by the difference it made no longer having a male presence in the room. The perspective narrowed and we were back in familiar territory. And afterwards I wondered what would happen if women refused to do the gender equity work when there are no men involved. I'm not referring to the work, the important work, the critical work that women do together around gender for themselves, because I think that women-only space is still really critically important. But I'm referring to the work that we do on behalf of workplaces, on behalf of the organisation, the gender equality plans, the work in Australia around Athena Swan accreditation and so on. When are we crossing the fine line where we begin colluding with organisations and contributing to a lack of change? So when we women do the work without men, are we contributing to the view that only women have gender and that it is women's problem and it's women's work to fix? So that's 2 pivotal moments in our journey. Of course, there's many more, but we wanted just to start with those just to kind of warm us up. But I will now rewind and give you a bit more background. So I started my work in the gender space in the mid-90s as the leader of a very well regarded women's leadership development program at the University of Western Australia. And naturally enough, as part of that work, I had often been asked, well, what about the men? And so that really has become sort of part of my journey since that point. Now in Australia, we've had a very popular kind of approach called Male Champions for Change that's really focused on male executives as champions for change, and men, a bit similar to the idea of men as allies, not exactly the same, but similar. But in both cases, I think this idea of men as champions or men as allies, there's a focus, as I discovered in some of my interviews, that really what men were doing is working to make workplaces better for women. And in effect, what that means is that men's gender has gone missing. So when we situate men as champions, we're actually leaving masculinity and the power and status and lived experience of men unquestioned. And so what that means is we miss any gender-based problems that men are experiencing in the workplace. And we also are not challenging men to examine or change their behaviours as men. So that leaves in place many of the male behaviours and practices that contribute to the boys' club and male-dominated cultures and so on. So gender in this scenario remains something that women have, and equity is positioned as a benefit for women, but not for men. Of course, we always also have men who adopt other positions. We have men in opposition, we have men resisting and so on. But we also have this, what happens is men, even when they are invited, are largely absent. And I've seen that a lot in the work around the Athena Swan Awards here in Australia, modelled on the UK Athena Swan Awards, which is a huge amount of work for institutions, and men, even though invited, are largely not the ones who are doing the work. Tim, could you put up the first slide? So I wanted to just touch very briefly on work that I did as part of my PhD, in fact, where I looked at male and female executives as champions for change. And surprise, surprise, of course, I found that championing gender change is a highly gendered role. And very briefly, what I discovered is that men are largely volunteers in these roles and are seen as quite kind of heroic when they champion gender equality. Women, on the other hand, were mostly conscripts. They didn't have a choice whether they took it on. If they were a senior woman, they were expected to do some of this championing, and they were criticised a lot for how they did it and what they did. But what it did is it really offered me a tantalising insight into how male and female leaders were actually doing something a bit different. And I could see that their leadership for change could be highly complementary. So that kind of opened up that territory for me a bit. I think it was about in 2004, Tim and I began working together, and that was really prompted by some work of his that he showed me. I was really struck by it, where he was looking at the role and the work of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in working together towards reconciliation. And I immediately could see how it could be applied to gender equity, because it had a very clear focus on the work of the dominant and the non-dominant group in working towards equity. So we will tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But what you can see from our opening stories is what we didn't want to do as we engaged in the gender work together. So Tim's story was really about, we didn't want to fix the women. We didn't want women to fit into greedy institutions. We actually want to transform the workplace. We want to rehumanize the workplace. And in my story, you can see that we don't really want to work on gender equity without men. We don't want to disappear gender for men. Instead, we want men to be on a parallel gender journey alongside women. And in my view, these two things are really critical. They're almost like prerequisites for thinking about transformative change in the workplace. Not tinkering around the edges, but really transformative change. Tim, could you move on to the Joan Acker slide? Thanks. I hope that many of you have now come across Joan Acker's work, partly as a result perhaps of the work that the GE Academy are doing. So she was an absolute pioneer in her thinking around the gendered organisation. And I loved her work when I was doing my PhD, and I revisited it for doing this presentation, and all that joy sort of came back to me. So if you haven't discovered her work, go and have a look. It still is very current. So Joan, in fact, talked about how families are shaped to the demands of the organisation, and that the feminist project is to make organisations more supportive of humane goals. So I think she would be very approving of what we're talking about today. So the gendered organisation then is constructed. And Joan talks about these gendering processes, and I'll get Tim just to flick through them. So I've represented this in a particular way. So we talk about the structural, the cultural, the personal, and the interpersonal, and that the structures are creating a gendered organisation. The culture is gendering. What we bring, the personal, our own gender scripts into the organisation, and then all of our interpersonal interactions are also creating gender inequality. And so what I loved about Joan is that she makes the men very visible in this model. She's very explicit about we need to look at the interactions between men, between women, and between men and women. So if we then disappear men as gendered actors, Tim, if we can see we're stripping out these gendering processes. One more, yeah. Even the structures would just become very holy, if you like, if we took out all the senior men in particular from these hierarchies that we have. So it just makes no sense. So if we move on then to thinking about, I coined the term the bifocal approach, which really builds on the work of Acker. And what I was really wanting to do here was to design and create transformational change. That's what I was trying to grapple with, and coming up with a bit of a model of change. And the bifocal really pulls on this idea. We all have multifocal lenses now, but at the time, bifocals were still a thing, with that little round part at the bottom where we can focus on the near, and the top part of our spectacles which focus on the distant. And the idea was that we can look at the individual, the near focus, and the organisation. And bifocals were designed to make that focus almost simultaneous. We can switch between the two, and we can link the two. So the bifocal approach was really about becoming more adept in switching focal length, and in any intervention focusing on both individual development and organisational change. So in fact, we're beginning with individuals, but developing ways of connecting their development to the changing of cultures and structures. And so my way of doing this often is around developing the gender insight, in this case, of both men and women. And that ultimately enables individuals to act as change agents and to disrupt and change workplace practices. So if we think back to Acker, what we're in fact doing is linking those that I've represented below the line, the personal and the interpersonal, to sustaining structures and cultures. So that's what we had above the line. So you can see in the next slide that the bifocal approach I've written about with Marieke van den Brink, and some of you will know her from the Netherlands. And if you want to read more, you can just download this from my website. That's probably the easiest way to have a look at it. But before I hand back to Tim, I do want to just kind of introduce a few caveats, I guess, for what we're doing today. Firstly is that we realize that we cannot know your context, and you come from an amazing range of countries. I was just gobsmacked when I looked at, where people were from in the attendance list. So we're speaking from a particular context, and that then means that you'll need to be doing some of the translating of what we're talking about. We're also sharing with you what we think is very much a work in progress, and we really acknowledge that people of other genders will have specific issues that we're not specifically addressing through this webinar. Some of the foundational principles will relate to all genders, but the primary context or framework that we're bringing is the power dynamics within and between male and female, representing the dominant and non-dominant groups in the workplace. We do also recognise intersectionality, and that power relations are nuanced around other aspects of identity and social grouping. In fact, when we use Acker's framework, that really allows us to explore this with workshop participants, because gendering processes obviously always overlap with other aspects of identity and social group, and they're always contextual. So we're doing it very much based on what's happening in that organisation. So over back to Tim now to talk a bit more about the perspectives he brings to this work. You're still muted, Tim.
I'm aware that my sound is not good, and I'm sorry for my accent as well. So I will try and talk quietly. Sorry, not quietly, slowly, so that I can make sense to you. I guess I've long been interested in how we create organisations, communities, relationships in which we can optimise the human spirit. We don't just want to optimize human wealth and efficiency and so on. We want to optimize the human spirit. And it seems to me that what we have in common is that we all want to share whole lives. And I've been massively helped in terms of my place as a member of the dominant culture in the work of how we build partnership together, how we build whole lives together. So going back to to sharing the screen, I hope you can all see this. It's a beautiful quote. This woman is an Aboriginal activist, Lilla Watson. She said this decades ago, and it's a much used quote in Australia. If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, let's work together. And that obviously struck me in relation to that mini crisis I had when somebody was telling me they didn't see their kids awake except on the weekends. And so I want to sort of give I guess, some reflections on how we can work together to become whole. And also for us in the dominant culture, how we try and get away from trying to be the hero, the champion, the rescuer, but still have a role to play in equity. So I hope this diagram isn't too eccentric. It's my way of making sense of some reflections I've had over the last 30 years. I have, in addition to working in the Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal space, I've been involved over the years in what I've called the men's movement in Perth, in Western Australia. And obviously I've been very aware for all my life of feminism and the women's movement. And the reason I've spoken of them as men's movement and women's movement is that idea of movement implies direction. It implies moving from one place to another place. And I've been thinking about this in terms of how we all want to live whole lives. So let me talk about, these are my terms. I'm sure there are other terms in the literature, but all of us are very influenced by what I'm going to call an outer world. And what I mean by that is a formal world, the world of structures, the world of regulations, the world of power. And this outer world has massive influence on all of our lives. So the outer world places high value on a range of things. I'm not going to go through them all together, but it's, you know, it values paid work in the public sphere. It values order and authority. It values personal success, all important things. And then there's also, if we're going to live whole lives, there is also an inner world. And the inner world values things like beauty and love, like spirit connection and happiness, like the heart, feelings, intuition, insight, personal and family influence, etc., etc. So for me, this is the world of spirit, of soul, of heart, of connection, of love. And it's a beautiful thing. For me, it is really a hugely important part of what makes life human. And if we're all going to live whole lives, we want to have both of these. We want to have access and authority to both these worlds. So I know I'm being simplistic here, but the women's movement, for really good reason, said, way back in the 60s and before, we need access to and power and authority in that outer world. And that was an incredibly important direction. My mother had to leave work when she fell pregnant. She was no longer welcome in that formal world. And that led to some quite heavy depression and a feeling of invisibility for much of her life, really until the 70s. Incredibly important world. The men's movement, though, that I've been involved in, I'm not talking about that reactionary kind of, keep the women at bay movement. That the men's movement that I've been involved in has had a different direction. The men are trying to explore, how do we get past the way that masculinity can turn toxic, not just on others around us, but on us as well? How do we re-access our inner world, our place of beauty and heart and so on? And it seems to me that what we are all wanting to do is to move towards wholeness. And I'm always struck by, in the English language, the word health and the word whole come from exactly the same word. So that full human health. So if we just reduce the idea of equity or equality down to how we get more people into this outer world, then it may be that we create equity in this world of madness, and that's not where I want to lead to. I think that's all I need to say, Jen, at this stage. I'll just finish off what I wanted to say. So what we were keen to do at University of Western Australia, and Jen will talk about this more in a minute, is we wanted to talk to them about how do we create a world in which we can all be as fully human together? How do we create organisations in which we can all be fully human together? And how can we get past this culture that particularly men over dozens of generations have become habituated to, that the outer world is what matters. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Tim. So just to kind of flesh out this kind of Partners for Change approach and what we were really doing there, Tim's going to talk about the dominant, non-dominant dynamic, which is what attracted me to his work. But I just wanted to say a bit more about how we were actually doing these workshops. And I think really it was quite radical and probably still is quite radical. So to start off with, we actually had equal numbers of men and women in the room. And we did this kind of, they sort of had to register in pairs, in collegial pairs, coming from the same sort of part of the workplace. And we achieved this by primarily through women who'd been through the Leadership Development for Women program, inviting a male colleague to come with them. And then once we had equal numbers of men and women in the room, we were talking about gender. So when was the last time, if ever, that you've had this experience of equal numbers of men and women together, focusing on gender in the workplace? It's really uncommon. Then what we were doing really is teaching them some of the stuff that I've talked to you about regarding Acker. How's gender inequality produced? So we were doing the gender capacity building work together. Tim and I were co-facilitating, and this is really important in terms of being role models, role modeling partnership, but also it meant that we could facilitate separate rooms. And this was a really important part of what we were doing. So we could have a men's room and a women's room where men were talking together and women were talking together. And then of course we brought the men and the women back together. And that conversation, that dialogue, that listening was really important to hear each other's perspective. And for me, that was actually quite transformational, for example, to hear men talking about that breadwinner script that they have and what that meant for them in their lives. And we also were really positioning people as agents of change. So that was kind of some of the workshop structure within which we started talking about this work that Tim's going to explain to you now.
There you go. I remembered to unmute. So just to give context, for the last 25 years, I've worked in the area of what I would call reconciliation, which is the process of healing and building trust after wrongdoing. And for those of you who are not aware, Australia has a truly shocking history that has cost Aboriginal people enormously through policies of quite extraordinary control, policies based on an assumption of Aboriginal people as not just inferiority, but inhumanity. And so there's quite a lot to recover from. And so a number of us want to be part of the process of recovery there. But the question is, what is my place as a member of the dominant culture, as a direct beneficiary of this terrible history that has done so much damage? How do we actually work together on engaging in the process of recovery? So this is a slide that myself and Aboriginal colleagues have worked up, and I won't go through it in detail, but there is Aboriginal work to be done and there is non-Aboriginal work to be done. And a lot of us in the non-Aboriginal side and the dominant culture side want to be the rescuer, want to be the missionary, want to be the helper. And increasingly I've heard Aboriginal people say, you're killing us with goodwill. So with this slide, there's so much more to say about this, but this gives an example of where Aboriginal people need to do certain work, and it won't happen unless we on our side do the non-Aboriginal work, the dominant culture work. So one that you can see there, obviously Aboriginal people need to step up, and it's a hell of me saying that just feels totally uncomfortable. That's for Aboriginal people to say. Hard for them to do that if we in the dominant culture don't get out of the way. And often those of us who are trying to rescue people, be the missionary, can be in the way. So I've just highlighted a couple of examples, and I'll be very, very brief about these. Again, this is very hard. It's usually an Aboriginal person saying this, but Aboriginal people do need to move beyond the impacts of our history. The more that they stay affected by that history is the more they collude in the dispossession. But what we know is it is almost impossible for a person or group to move beyond the impacts of trauma if those around them don't understand and acknowledge the cause of that trauma and its impacts. Another simple example, my Aboriginal colleagues keep talking to their young people and so on about saying, be resilient in the face of racism. It is much easier for, you need to know also that Aboriginal people are 3% of the population in Australia. Much easier for them to do that if the dominant culture is standing loudly against racism. So they're just two examples of where we actually have different work to do, and we need to do that in partnership. And I think it was this slide really, or this concept, that Jen got very interested in. So I'll hand back to her to talk about how we translated this. Oh no, there's one more bit I want to talk about. Sorry, Jen. In the course of that work between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, what we often do is we get a room full of Aboriginal people and a room of non-Aboriginal people, and we explore with them, what do you want the non-Aboriginal people to hear or the Aboriginal people to hear? We create a safe place for them. Even on the dominant culture side, we're so often walking on eggshells that we don't have the real conversation. So we brought that to UWA. And we had a men's room that was facilitated by me, asking what are some of the challenges I've found as a man in my working life, and what challenges do I think women face in their working life? And a women's room facilitated by Jen, asking exactly the same questions in the other way around. And then we bring those two lists, if you like, together into a very, very rich conversation. I remember one man in that workshop saying that when he was invited to a workshop on gender equity, he didn't expect to be talking about men. He expected to be talking about women and what we can do to help women. And this is a different approach. So Jen, I'll hand back to you now, I think.
Thanks, Tim. It was quite surprising, really. I mean, women are used to talking about their gender in the workplace and how that being a woman has impacted on their careers and working life, but that's a much more unusual conversation for men, and it was really important. I think, Tim, you said that they just wouldn't have said the same things that they said to each other that they were able to say when it was just a men-only space. Okay, so we moved from that into this idea of men's work and women's work, which is based obviously on what Tim was just talking about, and this idea of the dominant culture and the non-dominant culture having different work to do. Sometimes complementary, sometimes side by side, sometimes advocating for each other. But this is the task that they were given to do, and they were doing this in mixed gender groups. So what's men's work and what's women's work? And Tim and I, before the workshop, sat down and made our own lists and had a bit of fun with that. And then there was lots and lots of examples that came from, we've run this with a few different groups now. So we've chosen just a few to explore with you. So the next slide shows some of those examples. And so without spending again too much time on this, there's this idea, I suppose, you can see that women's work, I think, is not to minimize the impact of gender and to support the gender and build the gender awareness of women, whereas men are really at this very early stage of exploring, I think, challenges for men and having some dialogue around masculinity and what it means to be male in the workplace. So all of us want to be challenging assumptions about femininity and masculinity and feminine leadership and masculine leadership and what leadership is and so on. But I think, again, this is men need to be challenging men about the kind of the breadwinner script, the success at all costs and so on. That's a conversation that they need to be having with each other. In terms of the family-friendly sort of practices, I think often they've been framed as really designed for women. And actually, in my research, I found it's much easier for women to access family-friendly work policies and practices than it is for men. So women need to, I think, support this for men and women. Men need to use them where they are available, and they need to make visible their family and caring responsibilities. And consider part-time work and so on. So that's part of challenging kind of this script, I guess, around being the main breadwinner. I love the last three too. They're kind of things that if women do this, then men need to do this, or vice versa. Men need to do this so women can do this. Resist the domestic duties in the office. Well, if someone's resisting, someone else has to do the doing. So for men, it's doing the domestic duties, taking the notes, buying the cake, remembering the birthdays, for example. I remember also very clearly a dean saying to me, well, the women just need to learn to say no. And I'm like, well, who's going to do it then if the women say no? We were talking about all of those good citizen jobs that women more frequently step up to do. So men, in fact, need to say yes more often. Women do need to speak up, but men need to listen more and speak less and leave room at the table. So you can see we could go on and on with these examples, but I think it really helps to clarify that we have got different work to do because of the histories of how we've arrived at this place, because we need to have conversations in, I think, still in men only and women only groups, and we need to be able to advocate and so on for each other. So Tim, back to you, I think. You're muted, Tim. I get around this problem by not muting myself because I'll do the same.
I'm aware we're pushed for time, so I'll whip through this pretty quickly. But one thing that is interesting about this is the question of what's in it for men. What brings men to this conversation? And if it's just being champions for women, that will draw a certain cohort in. But for me, there is a bucket load in this, in creating more human workplaces. Does men's health matter? I've got a number of questions there. Does men's health matter? Men's rate of health is bad. High rates of suicidality, high rates of heart disease, poor mortality, etc. Most of that is self-imposed. Most of that is because we actually live as though we're disposable. We don't care for ourselves. And so coming into a conversation about what would make this a workplace that worked for my human spirit and human health, I think is a conversation we all need to have. I'm very aware that I've known plenty of women, this is probably a bit of a middle class statement, but I've known plenty of women who have chosen to work part-time because it suits their quality of life. I've known almost no men who've done that. We are in this habit of thinking that our role is to be as big a breadwinner as we possibly can be. And that can disconnect us from our children. It can turn masculinity toxic. And that does damage not just to the people around us, but also to ourselves. One person at the University of WA said for him, he only feels visible if he's moving upwards. This whole idea that I need to be getting promoted and promoted and promoted, very important to some people. I would rather that wasn't a gendered assumption, because I know men who would rather be working down at the men's shed. I've a comment from one person that really disturbed me, and that this is fairly typical. He said he asked his boss if he could take time off work because his child was sick, and his boss's response was, "Oh, is your wife sick too?" His wife is an engineer. And he said that there was a feeling amongst the men in the workplace that it was harder for men to actually be supported in taking time off for sick children. So I won't focus much on the last point. I guess I've sort of made the point as much as I'm going to make it. I think our currency of success should be whether a workplace brings out the soul and the heart and the humanity of us as humans together. I'll hand back to Jen now.
Thanks, Tim. As we've been sort of preparing, for this webinar, and then when I looked at the list of participants and saw how overwhelmingly female it was, I really started to think more about this idea of how do we engage men. And I think because of the history of the work that we've done, because we've started off in a fix the women approach and we've moved over time towards recognizing it's about cultures and structures, but we've never really moved into that transformative space where we are, using some of Joan Acker's gendering processes to change workplaces in really substantial ways. I think that because of where we've come from, it needs to be women inviting men. And what we're inviting them to is not to make the workplace better for women, but to be, partnering with us in this idea of rehumanizing the workplace and rebalancing work and care. That's our common cause. And we just need to be working on that in different ways. One of the thoughts that we had was, perhaps it would be interesting for those of you who are on the webinar is to view the recording of this webinar with a man, someone from your workplace. Pretend that you're coming to our workshop in collegial pairs and have a look at it with a man, have some of that conversation. The other radical thought that I still want to leave you with is what do we do when there's no men? When we're working on the gender equality plan or in the gender equity unit or whatever the work that we're doing on behalf of the organisation, do we just stop and say, hang on, we can't proceed until men are engaged in this process? I know how radical and hard that actually is. I'm not being naive about this, but it's a thought, something that we could think about. And I guess I just want to reiterate that we're interested in all genders, we're interested in the gendered organisation, and we need, as part of this change process, as we rebalance working care and rehumanise the workplace, to be thinking about the personal, the interpersonal, the cultural and the structural. That's our model of change, if you like. So just on to our last slide, I just wanted to let you know that there are, one back, thanks Tim, let you know that there are, we're still, lots of resources on our respective websites. I'd really encourage you to have a look. There's a few video clips of Tim. There's blogs that we've written together and blogs that I've written over the years around this idea of engaging with men, partnering with men. So, and finally, the next slide, before I hand back to Maria and Natasha, we thought it would be interesting to conduct a bit of a poll with people who are on the webinar to kind of be thinking about, well, where's our work, our gender equity work situated? Are we still helping women to fit in, or are we at the other end of transforming the organisation in some of the ways that Tim and I have referred to? And then obviously there's many points along the line, and this is entirely subjective. So the way you can participate in this poll is, I think the link has been put in chat. I'm just scrolling down. Yep. Yes. Follow that link. You just ignore the putting in a name part and skip straight to putting your, I'm just activating the, whoops. I've activated and deactivated the poll multiple times now. It is now active. You should be able to put your mark in there. And I'm going to share my screen with you. So as I hand back to Natasha and Maria to moderate the discussion, we'll get a bit of a sense of where you think your organisations are at in this respect. So I'll share my screen and you'll be able to see that. And thank you, Maria and Natasha.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks a lot, Tim. It was really a very rich and generous contribution from your side, really grounded in your experience with supporting organizations for rehumanizing. So what to say? Just I was struck also by your radical suggestions at the end of the presentation. And I was thinking, well, we struggled a lot in GE Academy as a project to have men engaged in our capacity building program. So we would have needed to close the program at a certain point and to really be provocative to follow your suggestion. No, but I'm now joking. I mean, we had interesting roundtables on men in gender equality work with several panelists, and we put in place really a lot of efforts to reach out to men. Not only the share of men has increased, but not as we would have liked. So I think that your presentation provided a lot of good hints and an interesting perspective on how to work with it. I think the floor is open to our participants for interacting with you and posing you questions through the chat box and through the Q&A box, as Natasha was mentioning at the beginning. Do we have any incoming questions, Natasha?
Not yet, but I guess our participants, we have a lot to say, and it's just like, I think it takes time to elaborate on your very interesting presentation, because it was really also kind of giving us from Europe, I think, a different approach to our work on gender equality. So I personally really thank you.
Good, thanks, Natasha. I'm just looking, can everyone see the shared screen? Can you see the poll coming in?
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like there's a lot around the middle. Someone has a 10. I really want to know who that is. Yeah, so, and there's quite a few people kind of, below the middle, I guess.
Mm-hmm. We have the first question from Jana, who is asking, what do you think, if you are aware about the process in the EU, where the gender equality plans are set as a condition for receiving the grants of the Horizon Europe funding? So I don't know if you are aware of.
Yeah,
So
I can take that question. Yeah, it's I mean, it's very interesting. It's the same a little bit in Australia. That our equivalent is that it's very important to get a bronze award in the Athena Swan process because of how it reflects on the university and how that might be considered in terms of by the major funding bodies. So this is what I find really curious, is that it is really important work to the university, but the university is still prepared to leave it up to women. So what if the women stepped back and all of a sudden it could have all of this potential impact on the university's capacity to apply for funding? Then surely men would engage. But as long as women are prepared to do the work on behalf of men and women, then we still, that's where this element of collusion, I guess, comes into it. And I'm kind of just astonished that in a way, because the men actually get the far larger share of the funds, at least in Australia, that they can kind of be blissfully unaware of the risk because women are taking care of it. So it is just a really fascinating kind of tension there. And women in a way are doing the domestics, making the institution look good for these external processes, and the men are benefiting from all of that work. So, yeah.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. I go directly to the second one from Federica, who is, of course, thanking you for the beautiful presentation. And she declared also to have the feeling that if it's only women are about to complaining about things that we are talking about, for instance, that in setting up the gender equality plan, they find very hard to engage men, but she thinks it's mainly due to the scarce education on gender equality. Like she made the example of her colleagues that never read Angela Davis or Judith Butler, but what to do if they even refuse to educate themselves? So do you ever experience this?
I think one of the really important things for us, and it was that Jen had a relationship with women who were aspiring leaders, and that effectively they did the work of getting men into the room. And I think a lot of this stuff has to be done person by person. Because that's one point. The other point I want to make, and it relates to that list earlier, we men are, and I'm talking particularly in Australia, are kind of habituated to some of our thoughts about what matters in a human life. And it may be that the conversations need to begin from the challenges that men face in being men. I did a post at some point about our parliament was absolutely dominated by men, and I did a post that says this is a problem. I mean, it's obviously a problem because we know how much organisations benefit from having more women in there. And what was really interesting is a lot of men responded to me in anger, saying, yeah, but what about the high rates of heart attack and so on amongst men? And my response is absolutely. Why are we continuing to go down the track as though that's okay? And why are we continuing to have organisations that make that okay? So for me, that's the hook that you can grab men with into the conversation about how do we make this a place where women are as likely to be in management positions as men, because and do that through transformation rather than, regulation.
Yeah, and I think that it's about the nature of the invitation. How do we go about engaging with men? You know, and I see the next question is about women in science. Well, immediately we're talking about men who we are hoping will engage to help making the workplace better for women. So what's in it for them? We're not actually helping them to think about some of the gender issues that they face. We're not even making the gender issues that men face visible in some of these processes, like in Athena Swan. You know, it takes a real, you know, I kept prompting in universities to go, well, hang on, you've got to talk to the men, talk about accessing flexible work practices, talk about what their experience is like. We're not even going there. So we need to, I think that's why the notion of partnership, where we do this parallel work around gender and where men will also be challenged, right? They are exercising power in particular ways that are harmful to women and problematic, but they're also doing things that are harmful to themselves and harmful to their families. And we need to, when I reread Joan Acker's stuff, she was really talking about the gendered substructure too, which is this idea that Tim was talking about, where we're really this kind of the public, the private divide, this inner world and outer world, where when we keep that separate, that allows the organization to carry on in particular ways. But when we do some integration, when we start thinking about people holistically, then we have to look at what's happening for men and women at home and men and women in the workplace. And it's a really different conversation. So I really think the framing has to be very different.
I guess also, if I've understood the question right, I think the research is in on the benefits of having women in science, and the research is in on the benefit of having women in organisations. And I do think sharing that evidence is also part of it. If we want to get the best science, we need to get the best people. It's kind of a no-brainer. So if we have organisations that you have to be mad to work in, that is not going to draw the best people into the organisation.
Yes, indeed. I much agree with what you said at the end of the presentation about the changing the point of view, about the, call it rehumanizing the organizational culture that include both all the gender possible. And I think that's really a good point. Let me go through the another question that we have from Jana. So she said that after some year in this gender world, she feels that we have even changed the vocabulary to describe the reality, like more accurate. Do you have any suggestion on how to change the current narrative regarding the gender that itself is provocative for some university audience? So it's kind of related also.
Is that like, how do we talk about gender without talking about gender? I don't know. I don't know how to do that. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to know a bit more about that. Gender is provocative for some university audiences. Is that because is men reacting to this is about women? So I think one of the things that happens is that gender becomes equal to women. So we're saying gender, but people are understanding women. So I remember years and years ago at UWA, we ran a conference called Engendering Leadership. So we really wanted to explore gender in leadership, and people just started calling it a women's leadership conference. So immediately we leap from one to the other until we make men's gender visible. Then that's kind of where people are left, I guess. That would be my response to that. I don't know, Tim, if you want to add something. But obviously the words we use are important. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't feel articulate about it. Again, I think I personally think it must be an easier conversation than it was 40 years ago, because 40 years ago, if somebody said, oh, women aren't as good as maths, somebody might have believed it. It's just not possible to believe now. I heard somebody say, and I'm not going to do it well, but they said, I'm so looking forward to the I'm so looking forward to the time when mediocre women get into management, because it's filled with mediocre men, but it's only extraordinary women who manage to push past all that. So I don't have anything wise to say about changing the language, but I think a hook for everybody is, how do we get the best people into this place? In the Aboriginal world, and like I'm sure the term is probably used in Europe as well, we talk about cultural safety. And for me, cultural safety is I get to be fully myself and still feel welcomed into this workplace. Really, really easy for me as a white, cisgendered, male. But it's harder for Aboriginal people. It's the same thing. We've got to make everybody feel culturally safe in the workplace.
Thank you, Tim. I think that just to comment on what Yanas was asking, I think that we are currently also influenced by increasing presence in Europe, and particularly in certain countries, of anti-gender and anti-feminist discourse becoming really widespread. Unfortunately, this goes together with some political dynamics in certain countries, and in terms of democratic backsliding. And I think this is part of the reason why gender discourse can be perceived again as provocative in certain. There is this background that in several trainings that I personally gave, I understood it was behind certain resistances and comments, and how to deal with that. It's well, we would need much more time, but I think that from your presentation and the hints that you bring on board from working on anti-racism and dominant, non-dominant cultures, you are providing several, let's say, entry points on how to do this.
Yeah,
I guess the further... you go, Tim.
You go, Jen.
Well, we're probably going to say the same thing. I think one of the things about the workshops and the work that we were doing is that we were not dealing with reactionary men, and we were not dealing with men who were anti-gender equality. We were dealing with men who were willing to be invited and who were ignorant rather than, so we're kind of helping people who perhaps... we were capacity building men who were willing but perhaps underinformed, and helping them to move from a passive stance to a more active stance, and seeing what was in it for them, but also how they might be able to change their behaviours in ways that would be beneficial in the workplace. So if you think of people on a continuum, we're really trying to shift people who are sort of closer to where we want to go to be even active in that space. So we weren't dealing with the really difficult end of the continuum, I suppose. And that can be incredibly time consuming. We can spend a huge amount of time just in, like with climate change, right? In Australia, we've spent a huge amount of our political capital on trying to convince people who are climate deniers, whereas really we need to work with people in the middle to help them to be more active in this space and to take it into account when they're voting. So yeah, it's kind of important who we're targeting in any change effort as well.
Yeah, and it overlaps with what Jen said. I think we need to amplify the voices of support, not amplify the voices of opposition in any change, really. Again, working in the reconciliation space, there's plenty of people, and they're usually wounded people, who say toxic, horrible, racist stuff. We don't want to amplify their voice. We want to amplify and connect the voices of people who are for transformative change, if that makes sense. We used to have a thing on our wall that said, we're not trying to get people interested, we're trying to get interested people active. And so for me, to some extent, you do need to ignore the mad voices, the mad reactionary voices, and just build a coalition of people. And that's in a lot of areas of change, I think, including this one.
Thank you very much indeed. Our time is about to end, but let's go to the last two questions by Carmela about the transformative mentoring, the role that could play for PhD students, and how to involve mentors indeed to make them understand the benefits that they can receive as well, and also what dimension should it address the mentoring. I know it's
I'm not even really sure where to start. I mean, obviously Carmela must be a bit familiar with my work in this space. So I have applied the bifocal approach to mentoring programs, and everything from PhD students to early career to mid-career and so on, to women-only programs, to mixed gender programs, to research intensive institutes and so on as well. And I think there's, this bifocal approach is really relevant to the mentors, and I put a lot of emphasis on training and working with the mentors, and I've now taken that into my work around sponsorship, which is making a distinction between what's mentoring and what's sponsorship. So I guess I would direct Carmela to my website to have a look at the sponsorship publication, and maybe I can come back and do a talk about mentoring and sponsorship. Or maybe, who knows where Carmela's from, maybe I could do a talk for their institution. I love talking about mentoring and sponsorship and how I work with mentors, but it's not really a quick answer.
Thank you, Jen.
University of Napoli, Federico II.
A nice visit, possibly.
We're locked in here. We're not going anywhere. We can't travel overseas.
Yeah. For now. No. Thank you again, both Jan and team. We really need to wrap up now. I am not going to go for a summary of the many super interesting thoughts and reflections and experiences that you brought to the table, that I would just summarize with a call to really challenging personal and organizational gendered scripts, and pointing at really building dialogue among dominant and non-dominant groups in organizations. So thanks again. I just invite our audience to follow our next and upcoming trainings that we have before we close the Gender Equality Academy project. Basically, you are still on time to take the doc, the e-learning course. The platform will be open for 10 days more to access all the modules on institutional change for gender equality and gender equality plans. Otherwise, I would invite you to visit our web page because we have registration open for different trainings on bridging the gaps, advancing research excellence, gender equality, and also methods for monitoring and evaluating institutional change, that I will be personally giving with a colleague, and another one on setting up and supporting internal change agents. So thank you to our speaker again. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you all participants, and to the next one. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you also from my side. And do not forget to fill the exit questionnaire that will open immediately after you close this session.